All right, in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at ethnicities as well as nationalities and those things. Your essential question will appear at the bottom of the screen. That's what we're going to be identifying with this section of notes. Your essential question is, what are ethnicities and how do they affect cultures? That's what we're looking at in regards to this section of notes. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to identify what exactly is or what are ethnicities. That's the first thing that I want to look at. The definition I want you to get down, an ethnicity is an identity with a group of people who share the cultural traditions of a particular homeland or hearth. Again, it's an identity with a group of people who share the cultural traditions of a particular homeland or hearth. That's the idea of an ethnicity of what we're looking at. And then what I want you to do is I want you to understand the difference between ethnicity and race. What a race is, it is an identity with a group of people who share a biological background. Okay, this is dealing with your biology, dealing with your DNA, dealing with your actual makeup. Your ethnicity is dealing with kind of your connection to a cultural hearth or a cultural tradition. That's kind of the difference there. Again, race, the biological ancestor is what we're looking at. Ethnicity is connection with a cultural hearth. Now, there's two areas. Number one, we're going to focus in on this lesson of in the United States, what's going on, ethnicities. We're going to be looking at where they are and why they're located where they are. There's 15 categories of ethnicities within the United States. 15. That goes to show us how we are a cultural melting pot, how there are a lot of different groups of people. In fact, 15 different ones on those boxes that you check for legal things, like doing your taxes or anything like that. You got to check your ethnicity. There's 15 different categories that we come up with. Ethnic clustering, the idea of ethnicities grouping together. Major cities are where your ethnicities are coming together and grouping together. Again, when we're talking about ideas of migration, remember that international migration, they migrate to big cities and then they're clustered within those big cities. Kind of chain migration, following your families around. That's what we're looking at here. A high percentage of minorities within ethnic groups cluster together as well. Within cities, you're going to see your minority groups clustering together within their own neighborhoods of where they're living. And you can look at that in a lot of different cities in the United States. The next is the actual distribution of ethnicities within the United States. Predominantly Hispanics settle in the southwest of the United States, which makes sense because of its location in Mexico. African Americans predominantly are in the southeastern United States. South, dealing with slavery and the African Americans coming over. And then the reason it's kind of southeast and more east is because of the movement of African Americans after slavery officially ended. And then the distribution of Asian Americans, predominantly they're in the west. 40% of Hawaii's population is Asian Americans. And the reason for that is their location. The Pacific Ocean is on the west, which is closest to Asia. On our eastern side, you have the Atlantic Ocean, which connects us with Europe. So it makes more sense for the Asians to be in the western side of the United States and not the eastern side. Next major subheading is why the distinctive distributions of ethnicities. Why aren't we just all grouped together? Why isn't it just a random distribution? Number one reason in the United States is slavery. That's why we see African Americans in the southeastern part of the United States. The first part of slavery that we're going to look at in the distinctive distributions, more importantly, is your internal migrations and internal movement and diffusion of cultures that caused ethnicities to group together. The first is interregional, within the same country moving across regions. The East Coast movement of African Americans, this type of diffusion, you had movement from the Carolinas to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. So if you were located in the Carolinas regions, you migrated up into those areas. If you're located in the east central regions like Alabama, East Tennessee, African Americans migrated to Detroit and then to Cleveland. If you're located in the west central United States, once slavery ended, you migrated more than likely from Mississippi and western Tennessee up to the north to St. Louis and Chicago. And then finally, if you're in the southwestern area, you migrated to probably Texas or to California from this movement. And again, this migration took place along highway systems and what became known as highway systems, kind of a key thing to keep in mind. Now, we're still continuing along with that why we have this distribution of African Americans the way that we do. So same heading. We're going to number 2, intra-regional migration. In other words, didn't move outside of the region. You stayed in the region that you were in. There's 2 main things that we're going to look at. Number 1, you had an expansion of the ghetto after slavery ended. What that means is the areas of the towns that African Americans lived in expanded and took over other parts, and maybe that ghetto actually moved. So you have that type of migration internally, or intra-regional migration within the United States after slavery. And then you also have what's known as white flight. What this is talking about is you have huge numbers of immigration moving out from white people within the United States because of fear of being in an African American neighborhood. You have what's known as blockbusting take place. And what happened here is real estate agents took advantage of this idea that the African American ghettos were going to take over their cities. And these real estate agents convinced these white people to move because they said their area was going to be located next to the ghettos. And also what that meant is they also convinced these white owners to sell their houses and land for extremely cheap so they, the real estate agents, can make more money by then turning around and selling it for more. So this idea was known as blockbusting, and it was the real estate agents taking advantage of the expansion of the ghetto. Now moving on to more of the actual separation of the races. We're kind of moving outside of the United States. The first part is in the United States, and I'm not going to go over it a lot because you've either covered it in U.S. history or you will. But it's the idea of that African Americans were separated from white Americans and that this separation was good. That it was okay to separate because it was equal. This is where you have Jim Crow laws. You see the water fountains, whites only water fountains. Again, right after the Civil War, well, not right after the Civil War, but up until the 1960s, this is what America was about. This is what America knew. Another area of segregation that I want to point out, because you might not have heard a bunch about it, is apartheid. Apartheid goes on in South Africa, and it's much more recent than the 1960s. We're looking at the 1980s and the 1990s, where this separation of blacks in South Africa, okay, that's a country in the continent of Africa, which coincidentally is in the southern portion. But predominantly the Dutch controlled everything, and they were segregating. They were saying if you were black, you couldn't be part of the government, you couldn't have these types of jobs, you couldn't live in these neighborhoods, those sorts of things. And it took people like Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress to come in and say this wasn't right. Because this is your majority of people. The blacks made up the majority of people in South Africa, and the Dutch were the minority, but yet the Dutch were controlling everything. So apartheid is an example of segregation of ethnicities within another country outside the United States, such as South Africa. Now moving on to conflicts because of ethnicities. Now this part we're really going to fly through because a lot of this you just have to find out for it about yourself. First is the idea of nationality, and what nationality is looking at is it's an identity with a group of people who share legal attachment and personal allegiance to a particular country, nation. It's the idea that we're together in this nation, our nation's better than yours, that type of thing, where you take a characteristics, a clustering or a combination of culture within a singular nation, and that idea runs, kind of the way you believe your behaviors and beliefs about other places. Now, one nationality that I want to look at is North America. Some of the nationality ideas in North America is things like in the United States you have unalienable rights, rights that can't be taken away from you by the government, freedoms that you have. In Canada, you kind of have a change from what you have in the United States, because in Canada it depends on where you are. If you're in the areas of Quebec, then French nationality takes over because French culture is what predominates in Quebec, but then in other parts of Canada you kind of have a Canadian nationality that goes back kind of to Great Britain, but really it's an independent Canadian nationality. So in the North America it's kind of different. United States we have huge nationality, strong nationality of being American, hashtag America, okay? But in Canada it depends on where you are. Now, number 2, next one we're looking at is the United Kingdom. United Kingdom, a heck of a lot smaller than like the United States, but their nationalities are split up depending on where you are. Number 1, the English are descendants of the Germanic tribes. They're the predominant nationality in this region. But then you also have the Welsh, which are Celtic people who were conquered by England. So if you're located in the Welsh areas, then you probably have a Welsh nationality. There's also the Scots, which is the Celtic people that lived in Scotland who were conquered by England and who are now controlled by England. So people living in Scotland have the Scots nationality. And then you even have the Irish, Celtic people who now have their own independent country of Ireland, but it's still characterized within the United Kingdom. So you've got nationalities split within the United Kingdom itself. So depending on where you are, nationality is a little bit different. And then last but not least, I want to point out that there's ethnic competition going on, and I'm going to give you two real-world examples. First is in Lebanon. In Lebanon, you have two different people. You've got the Christians and you've got the Muslims. However, we're looking at ethnic competition, not religious competition. All right? Now, how we get ethnic competition out of this is the Christians in Lebanon are predominantly Maronite Christians. It's an outbreak, a Roman Catholic sect. And then the Muslims in Lebanon are predominantly Shia Muslims. But it's not a religious conflict, it's an ethnic conflict because the Christians are coming from Phoenician peoples, out of the Phoenician ethnicity, and your Muslims, your Shia Muslims, are coming out of the Arabic ethnicity from the Middle East. So you actually have different ethnicities associated with different religions that create civil war going on in Lebanon. Now the civil war ended in about 1990, and what the civil war did is it gave each side a half in their parliament. But what you might not have known is that the United States helped out in this, and 241 Marines of the United States were killed during the Lebanese Civil War. Another one is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is one that we sometimes look over. Sri Lanka is that little teardrop island outside of India. Sometimes you don't think about it because it's just this little geographic area, but it's home to some massive ethnic competition. There's three different types of ethnic competition going on here. 74% of the population in Sri Lanka is what's known as Sinhalese. Sinhalese are migrants that came from India, and they're predominantly Buddhist. The second type is Tamils. Tamils make up about 16% of the population. They're Hindu migrants from India, but it's more of a recent migration from India. So the ethnicity coming in here is more of an ethnic Indian, more of a recent ethnic Indian migration. And then the last, you have the Moors. The Moors make up 10% of the population in Sri Lanka, and they are predominantly Muslim. So you can see the difference. We do have three different religions: the Buddhists with the Sinhalese, the Tamils with the Hindus, and the Moors with the Muslim association. But it's also three different types of people that's creating ethnic conflict. In 1956, the Sinhalese people declared that Buddhism was the predominant religion that's going to be worshipped, and there's still conflict going on in this area based on ethnicity, because the peoples within the areas, their ethnicity is creating conflict that they're not able to resolve, and they're not able to get over these types of problems. And again, we're going to expand on these concepts a lot in class. This is just a brief introduction.